Okay, then. It looks like we are live with Uplink episode 28, and we're just bringing Mark Mccorquin in. Hello, Mark. How are you doing? Are you receiving?
I am. Good to see you, Alex. All well?
Yeah. All good. Very nice to see you. And, it's an interesting collision of things today. Here in the UK, where I'm broadcasting from, it's the 5th of November, the famed anniversary of the gunpowder plot. There seem to be a few minor political goings on over stateside. Just to say the world is transfixed is an understatement. And of course, we're going to be joined by someone who I think isn't just hugely influential and I think rightly described as visionary for his music, but also because of the mind behind it all, which has done so much to influence the course of music with his production work and everything else. So we're really excited about that, but we're also conscious that there are many people joining us from around the world who only know Steven Wilson, and that's why they're here, and of course, as they rightly should be. But I thought we should introduce ourselves, Mark, and what Space Rocks is all about. So no better man to do that than you.
So for those who are new to this evening, I'm Mark Mccorquin, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Science and Exploration at the European Space Agency. So that effectively encompasses everything which is looking outwards, going to other planets, looking at the universe in various ways, different telescopes, different missions, but then bringing that to the general public as well. So making sure that everybody that pays for what we do, get some insight into the science that we're doing, the exploration, humans going to the International Space Station, and maybe in the near future beyond again. So one of the ways to bring that to the public is through things like Space Rocks, which is this, has become a central part of our lives, something we spend a lot of time on because it's so rewarding, connecting science with art, with music, with film, with creative people from all sorts of areas, and sort of making those connections. And you and I met a few years ago, and here we are doing this. It's been a great thing.
Indeed. Well, it's been a wonderful thing, and it's not just because of the, you could say, rich diversity of our guests and their backgrounds, but also because with every new guest comes a new juxtaposition and a new way, not just about space, of talking about space, but also a new way of, I guess you could say, taking something away from what happens when you cross-pollinate and when you could say you kind of smash ideas together. And I suppose there's something so special about Steven Wilson's music, I think, because he never does the same thing twice. Let's put it that way. And he's not afraid of making a left turn as well. And I guess you could probably say on a personal level, this is a bit of a trip for both of us as well, because I think we both consider ourselves huge fans of his work as well. And I think not just because of the music, but because of the ideas.
Yeah, I must admit, I have a little bit of trepidation about this evening. I mean, not because it's Steven. I mean, we've met before and we've talked, and it's fantastic. And I hope, that will definitely come across this evening. But I have been listening to his podcasts. He's running a podcast with one of his longtime musical collaborators, Tim Bowness, called The Album Years. And it's effectively the two of them. They've known each other forever. So they've got, lots of things in common, lots of things they disagree on. But man, these guys and Steven, I mean, so much music, such a plethora, such a wealth, and such a diversity of music that who knows where we'll go this evening. I mean, I like to think that I like a wide range of music, but with Steven on the line, I will be smiling politely, I suspect, at half the things that he might bring up. But that's why it's exciting. Let's let open my mind. Let's see what he's got to say about music I've never heard before.
Indeed. Well, I guess without further ado, we should bring him in and see how far we can go tonight. I believe we're live, and we have a view of a very impressive wall of records. Okay, I think we're there. Hello, Steven. How are you doing? Are you receiving?
Hey, I'm good, guys. Yes, I'm here. Thank you for having me.
Good to see you again, Steven.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll see you too, guys.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And before we get anywhere else, I suppose we should begin with congratulations on your recent space voyage. You just completed one more trip around the sun. So happy birthday! And
thank you very much. Yeah, two days ago I did celebrate my birthday just before lockdown. So we had a pretty nice party. Yeah, just a few friends. Thank you.
Well, very good. Well, obviously we're so pleased to have you here. And before we joined, we were just talking about kind of what Space Rocks is about, just in that it's this collision of so many ideas, not just about space, but also the way it interacts with art and science and music and all those things. And I guess this is a pretty interesting moment to be chatting with you ahead of the release of the future bite, simply because I guess to understate the case, it sounds like you have a lot to say about things. It seems like it's a record that's not just about the music, which of course for many is a left turn, but also the point that it seems to be making about the future that perhaps we're barreling toward. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a very fair assessment. I mean, to be honest, the album it's not an album about space, as you probably guessed. It's very much an album about earthly concerns. It touches on things like self-identity, consumerism, social media, all the usual things that an old man like me likes to, scream at the clouds about, basically. But at the same time, of course, it's all about the shared human experience that we all have. As you know, I'm very much a fan of the album, the idea of the album as a kind of continuum, as a kind of telling a story, taking people on a musical journey, and this is no exception in that respect, I guess. Yeah.
So we talked beforehand. I said I would put a different backdrop up, and here it is behind me. So that it actually does link the music and space and the Earth, in fact. So if you can, I'd step back a little bit. It's a bit obscure, but
I know this album. This is Vangelis Albedo 0.39.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the question: why Albedo 0.39? Right? Do you know why that name? Oh, no, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, I should know, because if I remember rightly, he pretty much explains it on the title track, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's been so long since I heard it that I can't remember. So remind us, Mark.
It's the reflectivity of the Earth. So 39% of the light that falls on the Earth is reflected back out into space. And we had this moment a few years ago, because we've worked with Vangelis and he's written music for or inspired by what we've done in space since. He's a huge space fan, as you doubtless know. And we had the chance a few years ago when he wrote an album about the Rosetta mission going to a comet. He wrote a whole bunch of tracks, and he asked my colleague Carl and I to name some of the tracks. And so it was pretty obvious we would try. I suggested the name Albedo 0.06, which is the reflectivity of a comet rather than of the Earth. So that's on the Rosetta album. So I, kind of a bit of a loop back, because I was a big fan of Vangelis, still am, but when I was a kid, and I know that you're a fan too. So.
Yeah, I am a fan. It's funny because obviously when you guys invited me to come and join you on the show, the first thing I thought is, what the hell am I going to talk about? And of course, the first thing that came to mind is talking, a bit like you're doing there with the Vangelis, is talking about some of the albums that I grew up loving that are very, very inspired by the ideas of space and space travel. And I realized, actually, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that most of the music I really, really loved when I was a teenager would be things that you would probably associate with space. And I'm thinking bands like Pink Floyd, Tangerine Dream, Hawkwind were one of my favorite groups growing up, and all their albums have got that kind of space theme. So there was definitely a lot of space in the music, that I was listening to. And it's strange because when I look at my own career, I guess I've become so hung up on inner space rather than outer space that it's not something I've really explored a lot in my own music, but the music I still hold very dear. A lot of it has got a strong inspiration from space and movies too, space travel.
I was going to, just because I'll forget otherwise, but I was, thinking about this earlier on. We've talked to other guests about the difference between outer space and inner space. And there's also that sort of theme which separates to some extent, separates the US approach to space, kind of the 1960s view of exploring, boots on things, conquering almost, right? Colonizing. Whereas the Russians at that time, although they were in the space race, they had a much more philosophical view with respect to space, this idea called cosmism, that it was about discovering yourself as much as physically going and discovering somewhere else by putting yourself in an alien context. So I wondered, from that perspective, you mentioned soundtracks. I mean, there are films like Solaris and so on, which are much about inner space. Where would you pick you know, a kind of a
Yeah.
juxtaposition of music and film in that regard.
That's interesting, because the more, I guess I've always been more attracted to the more kind of existential sci-fi. So you mentioned Solaris, which actually is not a film about space. It's really a film about identity and self, isn't it? And
Yeah.
and I love, you know, I love those kind of movies that kind of blur those boundaries. There's also one of my favorite, I wonder, are you familiar with a writer called Thomas Dish, Mark?
Yeah, yeah.
One of my favorite sci-fi stories. It's a short story, and it's a story written by Thomas Dish, who was an American writer, I think writing in the 50s and 60s, and it's called, I think it's called Descending. It's been many years since I read it, but it's the one science fiction story that I've never forgotten. And the thing is, it's got nothing to do with space. It's basically about this guy who is a bit twisted, and he goes to a big supermarket, and he gets on the elevator, and the elevator's going down, and it keeps going down, and it keeps going down, and it keeps going down, and he cannot get off it. He cannot get off it. He tries running back, and of course he wears himself out, and it keeps going down, descending, 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 descending. That is it. That's the most depressing premise for a short story you can possibly imagine. But of course, you read it, a lot of it is about sort of searching the soul and, you know, identity and what it, you know, the human condition and all those things. And that's what I love sometimes, which is kind of what you touched on there. What I love about space is you can use it as a metaphor for what it means to be alive, you know, the human beings alive on this earth.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, we've talked a little bit about, you know, Solaris is a really great example of the kind of sci-fi that asks big questions and challenges, right? You know, because I guess so much science fiction has become, you could say, really predictable and sort of by the numbers. And, you know, I mean, to throw things completely in a different direction, I mean, I grew up with Aesop's fables, right? You know, just you know, sort of like classic of, you know, ancient literature. Because, you know, at that time, you know, mythology consisted of animals and all these other things. That was a dimension of, you know, unreality that people could use to explore moral dilemmas, you know, and, you know, ethical problems and all those sorts of things, you know, and they were fables. And I guess for many, space represents that same realm of, you know, limitless possibility, you know, where you can explore the same sorts of things. But I think only when it's done right, only when science fiction, you know, decides to challenge people with things and not just sort of just be about, oh, it's this kind of spaceship doing this kind of thing and it's just like an action adventure. And I guess that's the stuff that stimulates, that's the stuff that kind of challenges and has something to say. And bring it back to, you know, the future bites. I mean, the thing about what you seem to be doing is, you know, challenging people in the same way, you know, because important sci-fi makes an impact and forces people to think about what they're left with, right? And I suppose what you're doing seems to be the same kind of thing.
I suppose in a way, yeah, I'm kind of exploring the, you know, the sort of idea of what makes us feel more connected than ever before, but at the same time more alone than ever before. And of course, lockdown and COVID has thrown all of this into even more extreme relief. You know, there's a sense that we're more connected to the rest of the human species than ever before, but at the same time, we feel more isolated than ever before. And I think a lot of those sci-fi movies you talk about, you know, it's like, for example, for me, the poster child of great existential sci-fi movies is, of course, is the Kubrick 2001, which ultimately appears to be a movie about, to me anyway, and there's many ways to read it, it appears to be a movie ultimately about one individual's sense of loneliness and isolation. And that's absolutely fascinating to me, that a movie that starts off about the biggest thing in the world actually ends up being about the smallest thing in the world, about a singular, unique person. There's another movie called Silent Running, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which is another movie that ultimately, it's a sci-fi movie, but it's a movie about isolation and loneliness. Moon, another example. You know, these existential sci-fi movies, they're basically about what it means to be a human being, ultimately, aren't they? And I think that's true. I like to think that's true of my music too. You know, that they can be fairly broad in their subject matter, but ultimately they're all a kind of reflection of my own, you know, my own neuroses and my own sort of perception of myself in this strange cosmos. You know.
So, touching on, you know, going back to 2001, the film is almost orthogonally less clear than the book, right? I mean, Clark wrote the book later on, and he just basically gives everything away. So if you ever wanted to know what Clark thought the film was about, read the book, because it's all laid out, right, in black and white. But Kubrick didn't want that. Kubrick didn't want it to be so obvious. So as you said, people come to it their own interpretation. So how much is that important with your music as well? Because you, of course, you often use strong visuals in your music. The lyrics are... I listened to you earlier on talking to Tim about the Cocteau Twins, or musicians who didn't necessarily sing lyrics, but the music was important. But your lyrics are very comprehensible, right? They're not opaque in that sense. But how much do you want people to put their own interpretations on what you're doing, or do you want to say, this is what I mean?
Well, a lot. I mean, one of the reasons I've always felt that music is ultimately, certainly my favorite art form, obviously. But if I could come up with an explanation about why I would think that's true, objectively speaking, it is the art form that requires a lot from the person that experiences it. So if you go and watch a movie or you read a book, and Kubrick may be the exception in this case, right? But usually when you go and see a movie or you read a book, you understand exactly what's going on. You understand what the character is thinking, what they're feeling, because you're told. Essentially, you're told, or you're shown what those characters are thinking and feeling, what they're doing. That's not true of music. It's probably not true of poetry either. Perhaps it's not true of art. But if you think of the three sort of most, the three primary art forms as literature, cinema, and music, music is the one that I think requires the most from the person that connects to it, that listens to it, that watches it or reads it. And I love that about it. And I think that's one of the things about the Kubrick you mentioned there. He took out a lot of the explanation, and basically what he's doing by doing that is he's inviting interpretation. So he's inviting the viewer in to be a part of that process. So you can't just be passive. Cannot. And I think Christopher Nolan definitely inherits this particular trait. But if you've seen Tenet, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You come away and you have to discuss it with the people you've been to see it with. What was that about? You're trying to fill in the blanks. And I think that's something fundamental to music, that everyone has their own interpretation. Many people have come to me with interpretations of my songs that were nothing like what I intended. But that doesn't mean they're any less valid. And I love that, about the fact that lyrics are infinitely interpretable in that sense.
Yeah.
We mentioned or touched on a little bit of, the problems of sci-fi, which is that it can be so predictable, when it's done without an idea of conveying something. And I wonder if that's like a theme that, kind of relates with your music as well. Because of course, we were saying just before you joined, you don't make the same record twice, and certainly from the sounds of your next one, that's still very, very true, and so on. Is that because you want to continue to challenge people in the same way? Because you do have to jar people out of what they think is going to happen in order to get their attention, don't you?
It's a very complicated question. I've asked myself why. I mean, I'm very good at shooting myself in the foot, and I have shot myself in the foot many times in my career. Just when I've been building up an audience, I've kind of completely gone sideways and changed tack, and the only thing I can really point to is most of the artists that I admired most growing up, and I continue to admire, are artists that you couldn't say were generic in any way. They created their own, to use a space analogy, they created their own universe and kind of populated it with their own music. So I mean, if somebody said to you, for example, how would you describe AC/DC or Iron Maiden to somebody that had never heard them before? Oh, it's heavy rock. Easy, heavy rock. How would you describe Willie Nelson? It's country. How would you describe Bowie to someone else that had never heard David Bowie? How would you describe Kate Bush? How would you describe Frank Zappa? To me, how would you describe Stanley Kubrick? What kind of movies did Stanley Kubrick make? He never made, well, the exception, he made 3 war movies, 2 war movies, 3 war. He made at least 2 war movies. But generally speaking, 3 if you include Doctor Strangelove. Yeah. Generally speaking, this is a guy that never repeated a movie in the same genre twice. So he went from 2001, a sci-fi movie, to Clockwork Orange. I don't know what kind of movie you call that, but anyway. To Barry Lyndon, which was a period drama, to The Shining, which is a horror movie. Some would say the greatest horror movie ever made. I mean, this is a guy that basically went from genre to genre and very often created what many people would consider to be the definitive movie in that genre. And yet he himself didn't have a genre that he specialized in. For me, those kind of people are inspirational. So your Bowies and your Kubricks, they're not generic. You cannot put them in a particular category. They create their own musical world or cinematic world. And I think that's something I've aspired to. And it means basically risking everything every time. It means confronting the expectations of your audience rather than catering for the expectations of your audience. And it's a lesson you have to learn. And it's not easy. It's not easy. You have to put up with a lot of, you know, hate and disappointment, you know, coming at you. And I understand why most people find a formula and stick to it, but that's not me. I just can't do that.
Yeah. So when I've been listening to your podcast with Tim, I said before you came on, I said I'm a bit intimidated actually, because, you know, talking to you this evening about music, because the knowledge that you two have across such a diverse range of genres. And it's not a kind of a learned thing later on where you went to music school and then your minds were broadened. This is clear that this is something you had from when you were very young, that you were listening to an incredible range of music without caring about genres per se. It's, is it good or is it bad? And it also comes through in the podcast that you really do. You place a lot of weight on people who just didn't give a fuck at a certain moment, right? They just didn't care. This is what is in my head and I have to put it out. So it's ahead of the wave rather than trailing the wave. I mean, there are definitely artists who trail the wave and say, oh, it's time for this kind of record because that's the one and those are the ones that fail quite often, right?
Yeah, I think for me, and a lesson I learned very early on in my career is if I contrive to create something, it doesn't work. I hate myself because it's not what I wanted to do. And it didn't connect with the fans anyway. And I'm glad in a way that early on in my career, I made a few records where I think I was trying to cater for, at least, if not for the fans, at least for what I felt the radio stations might like or the medium might like, trying to get a foothold in the industry. And it didn't work. It didn't succeed. And I hated myself for it. And I think that was a really important lesson to learn really early on. Just do what the fuck you want. Don't care what anybody else wants from you. And ultimately, I think that will earn you respect. And I think you do have to put up with a lot of negativity and disappointed fans and complaining fans and all that stuff. But I think ultimately, at the end, you find you are a respected artist who has carved out a unique place for yourself in a very, let's face it, very overpopulated industry. Most music is generic. To a fault, I find, to a fault. And it's interesting, you mentioned how me and Tim talk about, the music that we just like or that we think's good. We also talk about music that we think is bad.
Yeah.
But we still, like we talked about a Goldie album on the last episode, which I don't like at all. But the one thing about it is it's uniquely bad, for me anyway. It's crazy. It's ambitious, it's pretentious, it's reaching for the stars. Another space analogy for you there. Reaching for the stars, but for me, it falls flat on its face. But I love that about it. I wouldn't talk about something that was just boring and generic and banal. At least with some of these noble failures, there's a sense that at least they're trying and they're reaching for something. And I find that a problem with a lot of modern music is it's not doing that. It's not reaching. It's not pretentious. And I mean pretentious in the best possible sense of the word. It's not reaching for anything that hasn't been done a million times before. And that is something that I like to think at least I'm avoiding that syndrome.
Well, I think talking about Kubrick, it's really reminded me of something, because I guess as I kind of think about his filmography, which is, just monumental is an understatement. I wouldn't say I like every film that Kubrick's ever done, but I can't think of a single film by Kubrick that wasn't important, and I suppose that's the big difference, right? He never made a throwaway film, did he? It's not like he ever sat back and said, I'm going to make this rom-com because it just has to, I got to pay the rent. Right. And earlier tonight, you mentioned another filmmaker briefly, Christopher Nolan, of course, who I think is a really interesting one to raise because, of course, you also mentioned Moon, which I think has to be, you know, maybe the best science fiction film of, you know, the 21st century, simply because it aspired not to be a blockbuster, but it felt important.
I disagree, of course.
Okay, all right. Well, we can get to it. But Christopher Nolan is interesting because, to draw another analogy between, you know, music and sci-fi and all that, he makes really big films, but he also makes vast sci-fi films that, you know, really challenge and all that. So in music, you know, to say that you're not going to go out of your way to make a commercial record, but it ends up being commercial is also possible, right? I mean, this is the thing. You can be successful in music and still take those left turns, and I think that's what you do. That's what important artists tend to do. You know, they challenge, but they reach a lot of people as well, because it seems there are a lot of people out there that they want to hear that kind of stuff. You know, they want to be challenged, they want to be jarred.
I mean, I'd like to believe that. I mean, and I think you're right. Largely, broadly speaking, you're right that you know, quality and originality ultimately, you hope, will find an audience. The one thing I would say is I think it's harder now than at any time it's been in the past. There was a time, of course, lest we forget, in the 70s and the 80s even, when artists could release albums and tour and find an audience that way, and would not even bother to release singles. I'm thinking of a band like Pink Floyd here, for example, who reached a massive international audience with an album that they didn't even release a single for, at least certainly not in the UK, didn't even release a single from that album. That isn't possible anymore. That isn't possible. The world has changed. The music world has changed. Online, you know, online streaming and things like that have thrown the emphasis very much back towards capturing somebody within 45 seconds or less. And if you can't do that, it's very tough to find an audience. Attention spans are shorter. The whole infrastructure of the music industry has moved back in a way to the way it started in the 50s. You know, 2.5-minute pop songs. And that's a shame to me. That's a shame to me. I don't think, I mean, you refer to me as successful, which is very flattering, but of course, I'm successful on one level, but on another level, I'm not. I'm not a mainstream name. Most people wouldn't know me from Adam. I have an audience. I have a very loyal audience, and I managed to sell enough records and sell enough tickets that I can make a good living from what I do. And that of course is, you know, that is a form of success. But I would be lying if I said I didn't want to be a lot more successful. You know, I would love to become a mainstream artist, but it's very, very hard now. The kind of really, the artists with integrity that break through on a yearly basis now, you can count on the hand. You know, you can count on one finger. I mean, I would say in the last year, Michael Kiwanuka is the one that seems to have integrity and yet has managed to break through to a larger audience. But they're few and far between, those artists in the 21st century, I must say, few and far between.
Let me pick up on, just because I was thinking about this business of promoting, packaging, getting the work out. The visuals are very important in your work, in the sense that there are often beautiful videos that go with it. Do you have those ideas in advance? I mean, I know that you're credited with being involved in the creation of them, but do you let the music speak and let people bring an idea to you, or the other way around? So I'm thinking, you know, the videos now, Eminent Sleaze is a very sort of directed in a sense to the lyrics, right? Was that an idea you had, or did you work with a director? Did they bring that in? Because I'm thinking about the sort of director, filmmaker, and composer relationship as well. You know, how does that work? I mean, we've spoken to Vangelis, for example, again, bringing it back to him. He just composes from what he sees on the screen, and that's it. It's done. He watches it and he composes, he writes. It doesn't go the other way. The director doesn't say, that's what I want. So how do you see that with the visual side of your work?
Yeah, it is a very symbiotic thing, because I think I'm always thinking in terms of pictures almost as soon as I've got a song. I'm kind of seeing the song, you know, even before I've recorded it. And as I'm recording, I have ideas. So the answer to your question is Eminent Sleaze, as you say, was very much born out of the lyrics and the lyrical and the themes of the Future Bites, this idea of a kind of dystopian future where someone like a Jeff Bezos figure is like cleaned up. So there's a point in time has been reached where nobody buys anything unless it's from Amazon, you know, or a kind of equivalent to that. And consequently, the human race is falling apart and civilization is breaking down. So it's that very kind of dystopian idea of, you know, consumerism becoming, well, all-consuming, no pun intended. And that obviously came very directly from the lyrics. Another example, the King Ghost video, the animated video, I gave Jess no particular direction with that, other than to have a discussion with her about what, for me, the lyrics meant. But then she took that and adapted that and filtered it through her own kind of ideas and her own personality. And I'm as kind of amazed by, as everyone else, by the finished result. You know, wow, you know.
It's beautiful,
So I think, again, the answer to your question is all of the above. Sometimes I have a very, you know, an earlier Jess video routine, for example, that comes directly from the lyrics. It's the story that the lyrics tell made visual. So that's much more of a direct relationship between the song and the video. So, you know, any of those things. I like to think of myself as someone that's very open to ideas and collaboration, even though I kind of paradoxically call myself a control freak, and a lot of other people call me a control freak, and I am in a way. But I think the control only extends to the point of wanting everything that goes out to have integrity and quality. And to be a part of my musical world in that sense. But within those parameters, I'm very, very happy and you know, ecstatic when someone comes up with an idea I love.
Could you, just to finish on that one, could you see yourself being a film composer where somebody else's visual vision was driving what you wrote as music? Or is it so intertwined in your head that it, you know, it just wouldn't work, it wouldn't mesh? I don't mean to put you on the spot saying I'll never compose a film score, but...
I mean, the way it's worked for me, I mean, people have taken my music and adapted it in, you know, films, short films, even a few movies have taken my songs. So it's always been in that direction. Listen, there was even a computer game where they used my music and created the computer game around the music, which was very flattering. But you're right to say that it's always been that kind of one-way traffic in that sense. Listen, I like to think, I mean, it's one of my great unfulfilled ambitions is to score a movie. I like to think I would be quite good at it. Because I love image and I love the combination of image and music. I think the combination of the two things together, when it's right, is the most powerful and the most affecting art medium of all. Image and music together. I mean, when it's done right, that's such a powerful connection combination. I like to think I would be quite good at it, but the answer is I've never had the chance yet to find out. I guess it comes down to how much I would respect the director and the script, how much I believed in the script. To work with someone like Christopher Nolan would be a dream, you know, or Jonathan Glazer, who directed my favorite sci-fi movie of the 21st century, was Under the Skin, for which the score is absolutely integral to that movie. I mean, so Michel Levy's score to that movie is, you know, a big part of what makes it so powerful. So those kind of projects for me, I would love to have a shot, you know, at one of those kind of things.
Absolutely. So I guess, you know, that's the $1 million question. So what soundtracks or what composers for soundtracks have really spoken to you over the years? I think Under the Skin is, gosh, I mean, so I kind of just threw Moon out there without even fully thinking about it. But there have been some tremendous films in the 21st century. But what are the soundtracks and composers that have spoken to you?
Well, I guess just to pick up on what you said there, I mean, I guess Moon is very obviously a space movie. Under the Skin is less obviously a space movie. I mean, it's all set in a fairly grubby, you know, sort of urban, very much of this earth, isn't it? But it is a sci-fi movie. It's about an alien on Earth. So to come back to your question, well, the obvious one, you know, Blade Runner is peerless, isn't it? The soundtrack to Blade Runner is really peerless. Other soundtracks I've always loved. The Ry Cooder soundtrack to Paris, Texas, for me, is one of the great combinations of filmmaking and soundtracking. I mean, just, again, impossible to think of that movie without thinking of the soundtrack. My very favorites. Yeah, the Michel Levy score to Under the Skin is absolutely phenomenal. What else? You tell me some of your other favorites while I think.
Well, the one that I must say that you mentioned Blade Runner. Of course, Blade Runner 2049 was going to get a Johan Johansson soundtrack until that fell apart, and then it became. And I know, you know, I'm going to risk making myself unpopular, but you know, I'm kind of a bit over the whole Hans Zimmer thing, you know, kind of the school of soundtrack making.
Mm.
I mean, I was because my favorite film of the 21st century sci-fi is Arrival, and the music there, I don't know if it's integral to the story in the sense it's not an emotional lead through the story. It doesn't sort of set things up and draw you into the emotion, but it's as alien in some ways as the film itself is, and that creates an atmosphere. So I was disappointed when it turned out, and I don't know the reasons, and I don't think anybody does exactly what happened there, but I would have loved to have seen Blade Runner 2049 with the Johan Johansson soundtrack.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm a big fan of that movie and that score too. And I think what's wonderful about there's this new generation now of soundtrack composers. People like Johan Johansson, unfortunately passed away now, of course. Yeah. Max Richter, Niels Fram, who did the soundtrack to that movie Monster, if you've seen, or Monsters, if you've seen it. There's a new generation of soundtrack composer where it's not just about the music, it's also about the sound design. So these two worlds of music and sound design have kind of become fused together when you listen to a soundtrack like Arrival, or when you listen to Misha Levy's score for Under the Skin. It's not even about the music necessarily, it's about pure texture, it's about pure sound. It's something I also get a lot from, you know, when David Lynch is working on his movies, and he of course, he does a lot of the sound design himself for some of his movies. You go back and you watch a movie like Eraserhead, for example, one of the strangest movies ever made, one of my favorite movies ever made, which David Lynch was very involved in the soundtrack of that movie himself too. I forget the name of the guy he was working with, was Andy Splett or so. Anyway, but one of the beautiful things about that, the sound on that movie, is it's not even music.
Yeah.
It's pure texture. And the way that just pure white noise can make you feel unsettled and insecure.
It scared the living crap out of me, Eraserhead,
right?
At least in partly because of that total sense of being unsettled, all through my ears, not just through my eyes.
But I think a lot of that is down to the sound design and that constant that rumbling white noise and that industrial sound design. And I think this is something that Kubrick understood very well too, which is why you have, if you watch The Shining, for example, that climactic scene in The Shining where he's using the Penderecki piece, which is just pure atonal wall of noise. And most people, if you played them that music out of context of the movie, would probably say something like, well, that's not even proper music, that's just a noise. But you show them the combination of that film, those images with that music, and that music exerts an incredible spell, an incredible magic. Mm. And I'm a great believer in that. And I think a lot of these modern composers like the Johan Johanssons, the Max Richters, they understand that. And sometimes it's not about the notes, it's about the pure textural quality of music. And a lot of electronic sounds now creeping into these soundtracks, which is great.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is the thing. I mean, we're in an incredibly interesting time, but you just have to know where to look, don't you? You know, I mean, it's interesting going back to what you said at the beginning about 2001, because, you know, it just goes from the biggest thing ever, as you said, to, you know, just one human being's journey, you know, and you know, looking at, the future points, for instance, I mean, the future, ironically, is going to be more interconnected than we've ever been, you know, I mean, instantaneous communication and all that. And yet it's also a very lonely place, you know, it's one where I think we feel so isolated. I mean, I suppose, you know, in times of COVID, you know, for instance, during this lockdown, I think we've all been faced with, you know, kind of exploring a new reality, you know, and discovering things about ourselves. I mean, when did all the writing and the production for the record come out? I mean, because, you know, I assume it was pre-COVID, pre all that. Are you in a different place now? I mean, do you reflect on that moment in time before it all changed and think you're in a different space now?
Yeah, I mean, as you correctly divine, it was all written. In fact, it was all recorded even before lockdown. I mean, the album was finished in January this year, and it was supposed to come out in June. And of course, it's been delayed because of the situation. But so much of it's, as you say, in a way, and I would love to claim some great sort of clairvoyant quality, but I think actually when it comes down to it, a lot of the themes on the record, I think, are things that people have been thinking about for a lot of time now. I mean, we mentioned, you know, some of these movies that we've been talking about. Ultimately, you know, a movie like Arrival or a movie like Under the Skin, they are ultimately, you know, we talked about some of these older movies being ultimately about loneliness and isolation. I think a lot of these more modern movies, it comes down to our relationship with technology and how we're kind of evolving too fast with the technology for the actual human part of us to keep up with it and to understand what's going on. How is social media affecting the human race? I don't think anyone really understands that because it's happening at such an incredible rate. Technology is changing almost by the week, and the human race, I think, are just being sucked into this black hole, and we don't really understand. You know, I really think that the evolution of the human race has been knocked off course somehow during the last 25 years by the internet and by social media. Arguably the most significant invention since TV. I think more significant and ultimately more potentially harming to the way we're evolving. And it's no doubt that we're becoming more belligerent, more ignorant, and all of it is down. I believe the problem is social media and the internet and the fact that we've become more self-regarding. We no longer look out at space. We no longer look out at the cosmos. We post pictures of ourselves on social media and caught attention. We caught that kind of idea of a mirror being reflected back at us. So this idea that there are now 7 million potential celebrities on Earth, 7 billion egos all kind of competing for the attention of everyone else. That kind of insular self-regard, I think, is really changing the way the human species are evolving, the way we're thinking. And it really worries me. I don't like it. It worries me. I think there's some wonderful things going on in the world right now too. The really wonderful thing for me is to see a massive growth in vegetarianism and veganism. That's something that's completely changed during my lifetime in a good way. But it is one of the exceptions, unfortunately. A lot of other things seem to be going in the opposite direction. So a lot of the music was written with those kind of things in mind. How is social media affecting the human race? How is consuming affecting the human race? How a lot of the people, I think, that control our lives now are not the politicians. They're the people that write algorithms that get us to buy things or get us to, you know, people on YouTube, people who watch this also watch that. You know, these kind of things become all consuming in a way and completely dictate our life and the way we think. So that's what the album was kind of written about, I think.
It struck me as you were talking there about another film which is you know, earned a lot of plaudits in the last few years. It's Ex Machina. The idea that this sort of seductive, or not seductive, but, you know, almost human thing pulls you in to the point where you trust it, and then it just turns around and stabs you in the back and says, you know what, I am not you. You think I am because I've sold myself that way, or you've built up an image. And in some ways, that's a metaphor for social media. Come in, it'll be comfortable. You'll find your friends, but actually, we don't care about you. We're monetizing you.
Completely, yeah. Well, I mean, that's HAL in 2001, isn't it? You know, and I think that's fascinating. Ex Machina is a great example. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a great example of a movie. Was it? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark. Was it Stephen Hawking that actually said something along the lines of, or maybe it was Arthur C. Clarke. Somebody said something along the lines of, the day that we actually manage to create artificial intelligence will be the day that we have sealed our own doom. I don't know who that's a quote from, but it sounds. Could have been either. I think it might have been Stephen Hawking that says something along those lines, that he kind of prayed in a way that the human race wouldn't get to that point. You know, because why, you know, again, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator, isn't it? It's this whole idea of when you've created something that's so much more advanced than you, why do you need to exist anymore? You've kind of almost written yourself out of history. You've rendered yourself obsolete. And I think social media is kind of doing that in a more kind of quieter, more insidious way. It's a really time to be alive, I must say. You know, not just because of lockdown and not just because of Donald Trump and not just because of Brexit, but the way that technology seems to have developed at such a rate that I don't think anyone really understands what it's doing to us.
One could argue the things you brought up there, Trump, Brexit, and social media, they're all heavily intertwined as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're all a consequence of exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And and I suppose going back to the overarching question about science fiction is just a lens through which to see the world and explore ideas. The future, when you look at the classic age of sci-fi, the future was the thing to be eyed aspirationally. Optimism, all these things. We're going to reach out to the stars. Robots will kind of perform. And now it seems that we look at the future. Obviously, a theme that you're addressing, with incredible anxiety. Because it feels like an unknown, but an unknown that we feel queasily unaware of. Because we just don't know where it's going. And you mentioned, people like Bowie, for instance. Is not only one of the most successful recording artists of all time, but also one that always surprised and all that. And another consequence of the social media that you're talking about, it isn't just the isolation that we feel, or just this kind of weird addiction to dopamine that we all feel when we're on social media looking for things, but also the way that it's fragmented our media landscape. If David Bowie came out with a record, you could be pretty sure that everybody knew it was coming out, but now, because there's so many streams, there's so many ways of getting the information out there. I mean, is it even possible to kind of have that level of success without dumbing things down, as you say? Because I mean, you look at what the most successful artists, of the 1970s were, and these were prog artists, just like there are people doing things, that were incredibly challenging, yet it found an audience. Whereas now, as you were saying, it's rare that you see that level of success, unless not wishing to be unkind, unless it's just really rudimentary, really predictable, and very fast food, is the only way I can really describe it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think nowadays the music industry is so fragmented. I mean, the kind of music that my kids listen to, for example, some of those songs, I go on YouTube sometimes, and they've had like billions and billions of views, but I've never heard of them. And I think that's the point now, is that for the younger generation, it's no longer about the cult of personality. It's about individual songs. It's not even about individual songs. It's about 15-second clips of individual songs that they can do dances to on TikTok. So I can say to them, they can say to me, can you put this song on YouTube? And I'll say, well, who's it by? And they don't know. They don't care. And I think that's, for me, there's someone that grew up in the golden age. I grew up in the 80s, but I was very connected to the golden age of rock music, the 70s too. And it was all about the cult of personality. It was about finding an artist that you really admired and you believed, and then following them, buying the albums, listening to the albums from beginning to end, buying the singles to get the B-sides that weren't on the album, having the posters on the wall, all that stuff. None of that stuff matters anymore. If you look at the singles chart, certainly in the UK, I don't know what it's like in America. If you look at the singles chart in the UK now and the albums chart in the UK, there's hardly any crossover at all. The singles chart is just this endless list of urban artists featuring such and such with various guests, and I've never heard of any of them. And I look at the album chart, and it tends to be a combination of, this new generation of big album selling artist who doesn't necessarily have any star quality at all. In fact, they're pretty much as everyone else is. So your Ed Sheerans, your Lewis Capaldis, your Billie Eilishes, they look like quote unquote ordinary people. And then a lot of legacy artists. The Bruce Springsteen album is #1 this week, for example. But these are the kind of artists that will not get played on the radio, and kids will have no interest at all in the new Bruce Springsteen album. So they're listening to something completely different. And conversely, the adults, their parents, are not interested in what they're listening to. Maybe it was always this way. Maybe it's always important that the younger generation find their own music, which their parents don't understand, and we're just the next generation on from that. But yes, it's a very strange world to be trying to persuade people to listen. Let's just say that. I think that's a discipline that's kind of lost, an art that's lost.
I've wondered in the last 10, 15 years as well, as you said, that the way of pushing music is not about, or getting people to be aware of your music. You can't just put an album together. And, you know, a band that you and I both love is Talk, right? I mean, you think of those last two albums where they sort of shut themselves away in a room for a year, did some drugs, kept, you know, got 1 million people in, and then cut it up into 1,000 pieces, and a work of genius came out. They could get away with that. You couldn't do that now. The other thing which is interesting, and it may be self-limiting, is this idea that artists need to expose themselves. They need to be in closer contact with the fans. I mean, and of course the fans like that, but there's a point at which you become just another bloke sitting on a couch, or, you know, because going into a big arena in the 70s and the 80s and seeing a band up there who were completely untouchable. Right. I mean, I'm a big Yes fan. My first gig was in the Empire Pool, Wembley, 1977, 5 guys on stage. I was one of 25,000 people in the room, and that was it, right? There was no expectation there was anything more to that experience. But now it's selling backstage passes. It's about doing chats. It's about doing videos, the makings of. I wonder if you think that's self-limiting in the sense that it kind of breaks down the mystique.
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, and I've talked about this. I mean, like I was saying a few minutes ago, I think the cult of personality is no longer there, in the sense that you know, you cannot be, I think these days, an artist and not be engaging with your fans. In the way that, say, for example, if you look at an artist like Prince or a band like Pink Floyd, they were enigmas. They were completely untouchable. Now we find ourselves in a situation where I think again, because of social media, which has been this great leveler. So the really successful artists are people who don't look any different, who don't seem to have any star quality particularly. Yeah, I miss that. I do miss that. I miss that kind of mystery and enigma. The point of where you would go and see, like when you went to see Yes, that was probably the only time you would really come face to face with them. I mean, you wouldn't see them on social media, certainly at that time. You might see a picture of them in the Melody Maker or a magazine, and you'd see a picture of them on the record sleeve. But that's the only time you would actually see them physically moving in space, would be if you go and see them play live. Yeah, that's all gone. That's all gone. Do I mourn? Yes, I do. Yeah, I miss the golden age of the enigma. For me, I think I've talked with Alex about this before, the great poster child for the erosion of enigma and mystery is Ozzy Osbourne. Someone who I grew up listening to his music, and all I knew really was a few pictures on the album sleeves where he looked like this kind of Odinist warrior, this kind of mystical, slightly dangerous, slightly evil figure with the upside down cross around his neck. And now, of course, I can't get this image out of my head of Ozzy Osbourne trying to operate his remote control on his TV and falling off his chair. You know, oh, Sharon, I can't operate the fucking TV. And in a way, I feel sad about that. I do, even though I understand that my previous kind of thing was just a construct of my own imagination. I feel sad in a way that I don't still have that image of Ozzy, and I can't listen to the music in the same way, strangely.
No, I feel totally the same way. I mean, to draw a musical analogy, I suppose, it's the quality, I think, of all great music, where it's not just about all the notes you play, right? It's also about the spaces in between, right? You know, and I suppose a closed box will always be more interesting than an open one. You know, like an artist who you don't know, or an obscure rarity, I could throw out a million band names, Les Fungus or something like that, you know, where no one's ever heard.
Nicely worked.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the difficult juxtaposition now, you know, because you're compelled as an artist to be constantly communicating with your audience via all these different channels, you know, whereas, you know, appearing in Sounds once a month was probably a lot for a big artist or something like that. But now it's almost like you have to be in constant contact. So how do you maintain that balance? You know, I mean, I'm curious simply because I can't imagine it's easy, you know, because you know the audience, you know, is there, you know, you can be communicating with all the time. But then, you know, how do you maintain the mystique while also, you know, maintaining that contact? Because of course you have to have digital presence these days. that's the thing everyone's always wishing, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if I do. I don't know if I do have missed. I mean, I'm sure, I've been in situations where I've met, some fans either at a record store signing or after a gig, and they're coming up to meet me and they're shaking because they're so nervous to meet me. And that's a very strange feeling to be on the receiving end of that, because I don't think of myself as anything special. I am just a music nerd like you guys. You just look, you look around this room and you see I'm just this big music nerd. And I think, part of the, like what I'm doing with you now, I'm talking with you online and people are seeing me. This is all in a sense demystifying me. And I'm aware of that, but this is the world we live in. This is the world we live in now. As you kind of pointed out, I cannot function without doing these kind of things and engaging with my fans. I think the answer to your question is everyone finds their own limits. I do have limits. There's a lot of things I will not do that I see other musicians doing online. Even when I do concert VIP packages, they don't get to meet me. They get a little private performance and I talk to them, but they don't get like a one-on-one. They don't, all that stuff that I see a lot of other people doing. And that's partly self-preservation too. For whatever people think about me, they think I'm very arrogant. So often shyness is interpreted as arrogance. And I am quite a private, shy person. I feel slightly uncomfortable in those situations where I feel someone is like idolizing me. It doesn't feel right. But at the same time, I have to play the game. And I've enjoyed playing the game. I don't want to give you the idea that I haven't. Listen, I enjoy being up on stage, striking rock star, pretending I'm Prince or whatever. I do enjoy that, But I think the days when a band like Pink Floyd could maintain complete silence and complete enigma are gone. I think the last band to really pull that off is Radiohead, who do have a strong sense of enigma. But of course, they're able to maintain it because they started from a very, very high point of success. To actually be able to achieve that level of success by adopting that policy to begin with, I'd love to be proved wrong, but I don't think it's possible to maintain that distance and that enigma and have any engagement with a fan base at all now.
I was interested to hear what you said about the way that you meet with the fans but don't have individual time with them. It's 4 years ago today that I was touring in Australia with Buzz Aldrin, of all things, of all guys, and it was a huge event. There were 5,000 people in the audience, and the same thing, right? There's that idea you come off stage and you're just some person standing on stage talking about something. I'm not Buzz. I was part of the show. Of course, he's used to this. He's totally used to this idea that whichever room he goes into, he's the most famous person. I mean, it doesn't even really matter whether there's a president or a king or a queen in the room. It's still Buzz Aldrin. And the first event we did, probably it was, maybe even 4 years ago today, there was one of these VIP package things where people came to meet, but there was just him speaking for 3 minutes and then he left. And the rest of us felt slightly embarrassed that everybody there was evidently wanting to have more. They'd paid quite a lot of money. I don't blame him. I don't think the expectations were set wrong. But then the rest of us who were involved in the show said, well, yeah, we're here. Ask us questions, right? But it becomes a very difficult thing to manage, particularly when there's 5,000 people or one of your big gigs. I mean, you should be playing. Is it around now that the O2 gigs were scheduled? Is that about right?
A few weeks ago, that was supposed to take place.
Yeah, I mean, and how do you even begin to cope with that, right? Because the only way you can restrict the numbers to a few is make the price so astronomical that only a few can afford it. At which point, then you just sort of feel like you're ripping people off. Maybe. I mean. Yeah,
I mean, I feel very uncomfortable with the whole notion of charging people to meet me anyway. There's certain things I will not do. I say there's certain things I see other artists doing, charging money for meet and greets, charging money for extra money for being able to attend sound checks and that kind of thing. And of course, this comes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's also an erosion of the whole notion of enigma and mystery, which, whether people admit it or not, that is part of the kind of contract you have, the sort of unwritten contract you have when you fall in love with an artist or whatever. I think that enigma is part of the magic of the first place. So it's a shame in a way that that does get eroded by these kind of these modern phenomena of meet and greets and VIP packages and that kind of thing. I guess I'm just following my instincts a lot of the time and trying to get the balance right. I'd rather listen. I'm very happy to. Most of my fans are absolutely lovely, and I'm very happy to if I meet somebody at random in a record store, I'll very happily engage with them. But it's a different situation when someone's paid to meet you, or they've queued up to meet you after a show or a record store signing. The dynamic is very odd to begin with because they know everything about you, but you don't know anything about them.
Yeah.
And immediately that makes it almost impossible to have a proper discourse, proper conversation, to properly engage with each other. So it's something I feel very uncomfortable about, even though I would acknowledge that I'm also someone that's very often on the other side of that. I'm still someone that finds it very easy to be in awe. I mean, when David Gilmour came to my show, came backstage, I'm very happy to admit I was shaking. You can tell usually I'm not lost for words, right? But yeah. I was lost for words. To meet one of my heroes like that, I was completely in awe, even though, objectively speaking, I know he's just another guy, who just happened to create some of my favorite music of all time. But there you go. So I'm very much aware of what it feels like to be, as we all are, I guess, to feels like to be on both sides of that divide. It's another very strange thing about the human race is this ability we have to idolize another human being in that way. Simply because something they've created, I guess, has kind of resonated with us emotionally or touched us emotionally. We kind of then elevate them to almost this level of they're no longer human. So yes, I miss that a little bit in this sort of, democratization of pop music and rock music, the great leveling. But you know what? Maybe it's for the best at the end of the day. I don't know.
Fair enough. Well, I suppose to round it all out, going back to 2001, going back to your upcoming record, it's fundamentally, it's always about the human condition. Any good story is about the challenges that we face. And, speaking about, people in general, we have people joining us from all over the world, from San Diego, from Mexico, Spain, North Texas, Ireland, the list goes on and on and on. And they have some questions for you. So before you go, Stephen, just want to ask a few. And I'm going to condense a few of the questions into one with many sections. It's about the record collection behind you, because it's coming up a lot. How many records do you have? Are they organized alphabetically or chronologically? And what is your most prized record? Wow.
Okay. I don't honestly know how many I have. I've never counted. I'm not that much of a nerd. I'm going to say there's probably 2,000 or 3,000 there. I have a lot more CDs actually, which you're not seeing, but the other walls are lined with CDs. I have a lot more CDs. I have something like 10,000 CDs. I still love CDs, by the way. I'm not that vinyl apologist that thinks nothing's worth listening to unless you listen to it on vinyl. I don't believe that, but I do love vinyl too. I love both formats. I think 2,000 or 3,000 records, maybe. I do file them alphabetically, and usually within an artist, the chronologically through the catalog. Yeah. So that I am that much of a nerd. My favorite record. Well, I'm going to show you my favorite record actually. I'm going to get it. You'll be surprised. This is about the least cosmic record you could possibly imagine. This is my favorite record in my collection.
Wow.
And the thing is, you're laughing, but I'm not joking.
I'm not. I'm not laughing in a bad way. It's because we have a whole collection, a whole pile of Christmas things that will be coming out very soon. Yes,
I would never have.
The reason this is my favorite record, as you can probably guess, is for nostalgic reasons. It was a record that my parents bought in 1971 or 1972 when I was very young, and I heard it every Christmas for many years. And it has a special nostalgic significance to me. And I just think the cover is absolutely awesome as well. It's in a very 70s unpolitically correct way. This lascivious sort of man Santa looking in a sort of pedo, like giving a kind of pedo gaze down at this probably underage girl in the hot pants and the short socks. Anyway, yeah, I mean, this is probably the most precious record in my collection in a sort of sentimental. It's certainly not the most valuable. You can probably pick it up on Discogs for 99p, but it's it has the most sentimental value to me. I don't really have anything else that I would say is more important than anything. I mean, I have albums. People ask me all the time, what's your favorite album? I don't really have those things anymore. I'm more interested in discovering new music as a rule anyway, so hearing things I don't already know.
Good answer.
So before you jump back to the questions, Alex, because I'll take the opportunity if we've got a few more minutes. You did say in advance that you had pulled together a few bits and pieces of space-related music that you might want to share with us as well. That sort of be interesting to see what you pulled out there.
Yeah, because I was paranoid that I was going to have nothing to say.
Let me say we weren't worried about that. Let's say.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you might. I didn't know what I was going to talk about, so I thought, okay, well, let me at least pull out a few records from my collection that have got strong space themes. And I don't know if you've ever talked about this before with any of your other guests, but I realized that I have listened over the years to a lot of music that is very, very connected with space and the ideas of space. And a lot of it is some of the most special to me, the most dear to me. This guy, Karlheinz Stockhausen, I don't know if you're familiar with Karlheinz Stockhausen.
Sure. Yeah.
Great German avant-garde composer. I'm a massive fan. I've been a massive fan ever since I was a kid. And a lot of his music was not only about space, but the actual musical notation was based on, for example, things like star charts. Mm-hmm. This is an album called Sternklang, Star Sound, which again is based on the idea of constellations and the relationships between different stars and mirroring that in music. And then there's this album called Sirius. I just want to read you a little bit from the sleeve notes of Sirius. Sirius, the alpha star of Canis Major, 8.7 light years away, is the central sun of our local universe. 200 million suns with their planets and moons circle around it and live from its light. For the inhabitants of Sirius, music is the highest form of all vibrations. I love the fact that he's just talking as if he actually knows. For this reason, music is there, the most highly developed of all things. And I love the idea that music is the most highly developed form of communication on the planet Sirius. Every musical composition on Sirius is linked to the rhythms of the star constellations, seasons of the year and times of the day, the elements and the existential differences of the living beings. The music which I have composed and named Sirius transfers these principles of musical form and structure to our planet. Isn't that the coolest thing you've ever heard?
Well, I tell you what, I say this in public and we'll have to make it happen now. We will have to get you to meet Vangelis because he's obsessed by this idea that really? There are vibrations, that the music of the spheres idea, but on another plane up. And he's been composing music at home for years, which is not intended for public consumption at all. He's writing this for himself to try to find out whether this is true or not. I mean, he will talk for hours about this subject, and he's not, he's not off with the fairies either, right? In a sense, I mean, he's fully aware that there's an underlying physics, that the universe works according to rational rules. But as a musician, he has sensed that there's something else, something additional, and that music is a way to channel it. So I think you'd have a brilliant time talking to him, I know, for lots of reasons. But that particular topic would be great to listen to both of them. That
sounds fascinating. I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated by what I just read there. The depth that he went into this. Talking of off with the fairies, here's someone that is off with the fairy. Sun Ra, who actually claimed to be from the planet Saturn.
And who disagree?
And who are we to disagree? Exactly, yeah. So I mean, again, Sun Ra and his solar orchestra on Jupiter. I love that. I love this. The idea that this guy was making relatively earthbound jazz, fairly experimental jazz music, but always themed around the idea of space travel and the fact that he was from another galaxy or another planet, I should say. So I love that too. And then we get into the realms of a band like Tangerine Dream. One of my favorite bands growing up was Tangerine Dream, and Alpha Centauri. This is their second album. on this that I've never forgotten. Ever since I first heard this album as a kid, the sort of quote on the back of the record is, and by the way, the track titles on this album: Sunrise in the Third System, Flying Collision of Coma Solar, and Alpha Centauri. But the legend on the album says, this album is dedicated to all people who feel obliged to space. I love that. I don't actually quite know what that means. I don't know if it's a slightly Teutonic, sort of misunderstanding of the English language. All people who feel obliged to space.
Is there a German version of the album which was released first? It'd be interesting to look it up and see if it's been translated or whether it was only ever issued that way.
I don't think there was. But in a way, it kind of does make sense. I do understand what they mean by that. Because I feel obliged to space. I feel like I owe it something. So, but I love that. And then for many, I guess the ultimate space rock group of all would be Hawkwind, the mighty Hawkwind.
Absolutely.
So I pulled out some of their early albums: In Search of Space, Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do, and Space Ritual Alive. I mean, I guess we're into the realms here of a slightly more cartoon version of space, but I love it. And the fact that sci-fi writer Michael Moorcock wrote a lot of the lyrics for the band.
Yeah. I mean, his science fiction, of course, was of a certain genre of, not off with the fairies, but a kind of psychedelic view of science fiction, right? I mean, in a way, that inner space version of science fiction, although Hawkwind themselves sounded very cosmic outwardly, I think a lot of it was reflectively, about the human condition. Yeah. I was going to ask you that question. Sorry, we're not in a hurry, Alex. How do you, because so many space movies typically come with a soundtrack which is orchestral, which is grandiose, which is sort of sweeping. And in fact, it's something, it's a trope, right? It's just triumphalism about space.
That was Kubrick's influence, because before 2001, sci-fi movies always had theremins, or electronic sound. But it was Kubrick who said, I'm making a very modern movie here about the future, but I'm actually going to use very traditional. So sorry to interrupt, but I think ever since that album, you're right. Ever since that movie, I should say, you're right. Everyone has tended to go the same way.
And I think, if I'm right, the use of the Blue Danube was actually not ever intended. It was just for tracking music for the scenes with the spacecraft. And they just thought, well, it works so well, let's not take it out. So I don't actually know if they're, as a 2001 nerd, I really should know, but what the original soundtrack or what Kubrick's idea was. But I'll have to check. I think it was actually just put in for tracking, but it works, right? You go from Richard Strauss to Johann Strauss, and then you end up with Ligeti of all things, right? Going back to that sort of dissonant Penderecki music as well. I mean, so it's got everything, that film.
Yeah, I think that I get. I guess on a very simple fundamental level, orchestral music sounds big, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It sounds big. It has scale. It has weight. And I guess in that respect, it kind of suits this idea of the mass of space. Anyway, should we have another question from Alex?
Yeah.
We have a question from Mr. Wycott, who says, I suppose because we've been talking about the future and your record and all that, what time would you prefer to live in if you could live in any other time?
Wow.
When would you choose?
Well, I mean, a very obvious answer to that question is I feel like I missed the golden age of exploration in rock music. I would have loved to have been around forming a band in the late 60s and been part of that incredible explosion of energy and experimentation in terms of taking the album to a higher level, taking the album to the level of art form, taking the idea of pop music as it was then into the same kind of echelons that people thought about great art or great literature or great cinema. Because until that point, and the Beatles and the Beach Boys and the first King Crimson album and all those things, pop music was just that. It was something I think a lot of people felt quite was quite trivial. So what an extraordinary time it must have been to have been involved in that era, that kind of era when technology, new keyboards, new sounds, new hybrids of music. People were fusing jazz with rock, classical music with rock, folk music with rock music. So I guess, from a purely professional point of view, I also like to think that my music would have probably reached a lot more people if I'd been making it. So from a purely, musical perspective, I would have loved to have been operating, probably about 20 years before, actually to have emerged 20 years before, as a musician.
I don't know if you've read it. I mean, I don't know if you know the author David Mitchell, who wrote Cloud Atlas, and
I know of, yes. Yeah.
his latest novel came out this summer, and I've just started it a couple of days ago. It's called Utopia Avenue, and it's exactly about that time. It's set bands being formed in the late 60s. The first page, he's walking past a coffee shop and he says, "Oh, and there's Rick One Take Wakeman sitting in the coffee shop, before his next session." And I haven't got far enough into it to know how it develops, and I never read the back of books, but it's exactly that scene. Bands in sweaty basements, beginning to invent the next those genres. So I can thoroughly recommend, from what I've read, the first 2 chapters, and I love Mitchell's books anyway.
You're not the first person. My guy at my record company, Michael, has been raving about this book. I will get around to it. Yeah.
Excellent.
There are various cheers going on in our chat room, for the different records that you've been showing, and Hawkwind definitely created one for sure. So we talked about whether you would like to make soundtracks, of course, and it sounds like you would. But you mentioned Michael Moorcock as well. Who had such a integral responsibility, in his work with Hawkwind, and he's responsible for so much of why I think they resonate with so many people. Are there any science fiction writers or other people you'd like to work with, perhaps in that way, lyrically, or just like at a deeper level, not in film, but in sci-fi writing? Any people that you would like to interact with that way?
That's a very good question. I would love to do the soundtrack to a film adaptation of Thomas Dish's Descending, the most depressing short story ever written. Certainly the most depressing sci-fi show. No, seriously, I would love to see an adaptation of that sometime. Listen, I think, sci-fi writers for me, most of the ones I'm really familiar with, I guess, are probably passed away now. I'm thinking of Kurt Vonnegut. I would love to soundtrack a Kurt Vonnegut movie, or Richard Brautigan is another one. It seemed to me a bit, we're talking about music having this golden era. It seemed to me that sci-fi also had a real golden era, didn't it? When people were thinking about these ideas, Philip K. Dick and, all those guys seem to come out around about a similar time, halfway through the 20th century. People started to think about these things and think about these ideas. It seemed to be a wonderful time to be writing sci-fi literature as well. And to be fair, a lot of these ideas have still yet to find their way into the movie world. I'm surprised in a way so few people have attempted to film Kurt Vonnegut. Maybe they're unfilmable. They are very strange books, it must be said. They're very meta, aren't they? They're kind of playing with these ideas of time and perspective, and I don't know, maybe they're just impossible to film, but I would love, for example, to score a Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah, Philip K. Dick has become a sort of a favourite of people wanting to make films, and his books are not easy either, particularly. True, but I will, we'll talk later, because I think there's lots of brilliant science fiction being written today as well, which is, we talked about Arrival, the short story for Arrival written by Ted Chiang, his whole book of short stories. And Alex and I often talk about Chinese science fiction, for example, and the ways that they are exploring culturally from a wholly different perspective, similar themes. So they don't kind of follow Western tropes. So there's a lot of great stuff. We'll share some things with you.
I'm sure I'm very ignorant. I'm sure there's some wonderful stuff.
Yeah. There's just a lot out there. I think what's important is simply to be curious. And I suppose, Stephen, there's no one more adventurous than you in the world of music, just in terms of all the things that you've done. And so whatever you do, I'm sure it'll always be very, very interesting. And I think for all of the audience who have joined us today, and, speaking for, I'm sure, Mark as well, I feel like we have to try this again sometime, because there are so many questions that we have and so many more areas that we would love to explore with you. But for now, on behalf of everyone at Space Rocks and everyone who joined us from all around the world tonight, can I just say thank you so much for your time and for helping us explore some of those ideas, at least. Thank
you for having me. It's been a lot of fun, actually. My paranoia was unfounded.
Absolutely.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear.
So we do one little thing, which is to put you, we talked about, the loss of mystique and integrity and being asked to do performing dog tricks. Guess what? We have one for you. It's not that bad. So it's a test, actually, of your manual dexterity. So just because it's Space Rocks, we have this little, actually, this is the wrong one. I've got it wrong. So this is Space. So this is your Vulcan salute, live long and prosper.
Yeah.
And rocks. So. Just at the
Okay, am
moment,
I
your
doing the right way around?
you've got it perfectly the right way around. Excellent. So yeah, sorry, you know, the mystique has dropped another notch there,
Yeah,
Stephen.
sorry, he's never going to come back now, Mark. So you know,
Yeah, the one person, I will say, the one person we have not asked to do that, and we didn't even ask, was Anthony Daniels, so C-3PO. We thought crossing the franchise Star Wars to Star Trek would be a disaster, so we let him off on that one. But everybody else, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We'll talk to you soon.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Cheers. Nice to speak to you guys. Bye for now.
Great to speak
Thanks,
with you.
Stephen. Ta-ra.
Thank you very much. Well, there we go, Mark. I mean, gosh, episode 28 is done. And, you know, I have to say, we just had so many more questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Sorry to so many of the people, you know, who had great ones. But, you know, the time really flies when you're having fun, or indeed when you're kind of...
Well, and when I keep stealing the questions, unfortunately, because, you know, I love nothing more than talking to people like Stephen, who are in a world separate from mine, but in work terms, but culturally and philosophically, you know, I feel like we're sort of one big family, and it's brilliant to have talked to him this evening.
I could not agree more. And we have more chats ahead of us. I think
Yeah.
it would be wonderful to invite him back, certainly. But next week, we'll be celebrating a very special anniversary, I think, with two of the most qualified people in the world to talk about it as well, for episode 29. Yeah,
so people may have seen in the press recently, I mean, if you've been dragging yourself away from the big red and blue headline on top of everything, that in the last week or so, I think it was last week, was the 20th anniversary of permanent occupancy of the International Space Station. So Space Station has been built up over years. There were many shuttle flights, European flights, Russian flights, but it's been 20 years since the space station has never been without a crew. And so we thought we would celebrate that by inviting a couple of people on from where I work at the European Space Agency. And the first of those is Frank de Winne, who's been to the space station twice. He was there quite early on in 2002. He was the commander of the space station during one of his missions. And he's now the head of the European Astronaut Center. So where our astronauts live and work in Germany, in near Cologne, Frank's the head of that, and he's one of my colleagues in the Human and Robotic Exploration Directorate. He also has some great links. When he was in orbit, he worked with U2, one of their tours. He was beamed down into their tour, and he's worked with Patrick Stewart as well from Star Trek. So great guy to have on in the Space Rocks context. And then one of our newer colleagues who's joined ESA in the last year, actually, is Angelique von Ombergen. And she's a doctor, she's a medical doctor, and she works on human biology in space. How do people react to space? How do people adapt? How do they not adapt? What works, what doesn't work? And that includes ground experiments as well as what goes on the space station. And this is all important because as we now talk about going back to the moon, or maybe even going on the long journey to Mars, what have we learned from the ISS? What have we, do we know how well humans will adapt above the radiation belts on the long journey, not just physically, but psychologically? So I think between Frank, who's an ex-fighter pilot, and Angelique, who's a scientist, and she's also a book author and does lots of outreach, I think we'll get a great insight into what the space station has done in the kind of the human quest for exploring space in the last 20 years. So I'm excited about that. I will say the one thing that we're not next week is diverse, because they're both Belgian, so we don't have nationality diversity. But yeah, they've both got a lot to bring to this chat that we'll have next week. So I'm looking forward to it.
Indeed, it's going to be a fantastic time. And, you know, if you want to stay abreast of what we're doing with Space Rocks, or for future episodes of Uplink, please visit us on spacerocksofficial.com and subscribe to our newsletter, which is going to provide weekly updates. Find us on social, keep in touch, let us know what you like, and we'll see you again very soon indeed. Mark, as ever, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.